morning. I grew up in Chicago, so the notion of a redwood tree was something that I'd only derived from looking at a fourth grade black and white geography book. But I finally did see a redwood forest. But I think actually we have in our guests this morning, our panelists, Roy Bourgeois and Cindy Sheehan, people whom I would liken to a redwood forest. Towering in their moral strength, but also so protective of the capacity of all of us to continue to do the things that make for peace, and at great risk to themselves, and yet presenting a way that always makes it look attractive, that draws people in. So we're a happy group of saplings here, I hope you both know, and very, very pleased to welcome you. Thank you also, all of you who've come to this time. I think the last workshop got out a little bit late, so people might be filtering in. And there are plenty of seats up front if anyone would like to keep on moving forward. Anyway, I'd like to first introduce Roy Bourgeois. Roy is somebody that first came into the uptown neighborhood where I lived when he was a Maryknoll priest who had recently left mission work in Bolivia. Prior to entering Maryknoll, he'd been in Vietnam, and in the Vietnam War, he converted, I would say, went full circle into being somebody who would dedicate his life to working for peace in many, many different ways. I remember one time, Roy, while people were mopping up at a soup kitchen, and before he went back to the Wilson Men's Club where he lived because the Catholic Worker House was too posh for him, Roy said, "I'm going to make a movie." We all had a sure, Roy. And within, I think, in 2 years, there was an Academy Award nomination for Roy's movie, Gods of Metal. But he had a very special attentiveness to the people in South and Central America. And so, as many, many actions have happened, and often actions like occupying a cathedral in Minneapolis, Minnesota, dramatic actions that drew many more people into care and concern about what was happening in Central America, Roy realized that torture and oppression were being taught, means inclusive of massacres and assassinations and death squads, were being fostered at the Army School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia. And so his methods, always nonviolent, to counteract that have been inclusive of long stays in prison, inclusive of relentless and tireless organizing, and inclusive of the development of a campaign called School of America's Watch, which has just been brilliant. You would also have seen Roy recently in South America. He was over in Baghdad shortly before the bombs started falling. He's given of his time and his energy and his desire to form the beloved community to numerous communities and to ours today. Roy, thank you for being here.
Good morning. Just want to begin by saying it's a real honor to be with you. I want to thank Prout for all their hard work at bringing the conference together. A special joy for me to be with Kathy, Kelly, and Cindy Sheehan. I think it's extremely important that we come together at this time, very challenging times. Our country's at war once again. So many of our sisters and brothers are victims of discrimination, of violence, living on the edge, struggling for survival. And over these past few years, especially since 9/11, I and others have come to the conclusion that our greatest enemy in the United States is ignorance. There is so little that we know about our country's foreign policy and what it means to those on the receiving end. There's so little that we know about other countries, their cultures, histories, religious beliefs, so much older than our own. And as we have discovered, that ignorance will get us in big trouble, as individuals and, of course, as a nation. I find a lot of wisdom in the Old Testament prophet Isaiah. It's really being lived out today. Isaiah said, "They will take evil and call it good. They will take the lie and call it truth." And our leaders have become very skilled at that. How skilled they have been to present that lie to us as the truth, the evil is good. It took Vietnam to awaken something in me. I think as we come together as activists, as peacemakers, we all realize, if we go back and reflect, there were those experiences and individuals in our lives that awakened us about peace. We were not born activists. Many of us, myself included, came from very conservative roots. Small town in Louisiana. We did not critique foreign policy or question the decrees of Caesar. No. We were patriotic. And I was a product of that environment. And when Vietnam came along, many went off to that war, believing the lie, as many bought into the lie of Iraq. They said back then that our cause was going to be noble. We were going to be the liberators. The same language, of course, used to justify the crimes in Iraq. And I went off to that war, and many there and here at home were changed by that experience. And that's what war does. I've come to the conclusion again, as many, we are not made for war. We're not made for the business of killing. We cannot go on with war making and go on with our lives as before. Something happens deep within our souls, our hearts. And it was only the beginning of that for me in Vietnam, this awakening. Something telling me this is wrong. This is not the way it should be. I'm reading this book now by Camilo Mejia. Many of you know Camilo's story. I talk about Camilo wherever I speak. I'm often, most of the time, invited to speak about the S-Way that I'm going to get into, this issue of the School of the Americas. But I say to audiences, especially in high schools and universities, that we've got to talk about Iraq. How can we gather in the name of peace and not talk about what's going on there? And I use Camilo's story because he's a real inspiration to many. He came back from Iraq, first going there and believing in the cause, as many did. And he came to that conclusion: it was wrong, it was immoral, it was a crime. And he said, no, I'm not returning. You know the story. He was court-martialed, sent to prison for 9 months. And he received thousands and thousands of letters. And when he got out of prison, he was asked the basic question, how was it, Camilo? And he said to us, I was at peace. And the reason being, of course, was he followed his conscience. And that's what happens when we follow our conscience. We can sleep at night. He was at peace. At the end of this book, Chris Hedges, well-known writer, says this about war. I just quote here. I think it captures very well what many of us have experienced. War is industrial slaughter. Its essence is death. It deforms all those who engage in it. In war, the old always sacrifice the young. The cynics send idealists to die for them. And politicians sell out the very soldiers they lure into the battle. War is always finally about betrayal. Now, add war kills hope, and that's what happened to me in Vietnam. I lost my hope, and I wanted to recapture that, not knowing where to find it again. I entered the religious community, the Marino community. I grew up working in 25 countries out overseas, serving the poor. I wanted to be a peacemaker, a healer, whatever that meant at that time. I was ordained a Catholic priest and then assigned to our work in Bolivia to serve the poor. A slum on the outskirts of La Paz became my home for the next 5 years. And it was here where I got educated. And the poor became my teachers and really started to educate this gringo. Bolivia is like most countries in the developing world. Their people are living on the edge, struggling for survival. They're in the shacks without running water. Very few schools. When they're sick, there's not clinics or hospitals to go to get healed. And so many of their children will not make it beyond the age of 4 or 5. And that continues in so many countries today. And here at home, so many are struggling. But yet we have billions, and I mean billions. It's hard to determine how much this is. Certainly it's over $500 billion that have been pumped thus far into this war. And what can we say other than that? It is a theft. It is a theft from those in Bolivia and so many countries, including here at home, who are struggling. Many dying before their time. How do we justify this? The budget just passed again. Different amendments to try and bring some meaning to it. We're going to give now some college courses to troops when they come home. To justify the madness, to justify the theft, to justify the evil. Our life had meaning in Bolivia, just to be a part of that struggle for liberation, for peace. Bolivia was under a brutal dictator, General Bonza, one of the many throughout Latin America, Central America, closely tied with the oligarchies who were oppressing the poor. We supported that dictator, General Hugo Bonza, along with so many others, Pinochet, and all of the dictators in Central America. In the 5th year, the oppression intensified. University students, 10 minus campesinos, we started coming together to speak out for life, for peace, for justice. The jails filled up, many were killed. I was among the many arrested in my 5th year there and forced out of the country. I came home, a very lonely time. Then I went to Chicago, where I met Kathy Kelly and great folks at the Catholic Worker House in uptown Chicago, folks in CSPIS, and started working on an important issue, El Salvador, along with that nuclear arms race issue. I later went to El Salvador with others and found a country far worse than the one I came from. I've never seen anything like El Salvador. It was the slaughter of the innocents. Once again, we found our country, the United States, deeply involved, giving guns, training to those doing the killing. Campesinos who couldn't make it on $1 a day, who were saying basta, we need food for the table, were branded subversive, Marxista. University students, social workers, human rights advocates. They were all targets. It was after Archbishop Oscar Romero was killed, and 4 churchwomen were raped and killed, 2 of them friends of the Marino community, that brought us closer to El Salvador. And when 500 soldiers from El Salvador arrived at Fort Benning, Georgia, to start training now on U.S. soil and combat, a few of us simply said, not in our name. We went there to protest, started organizing, resisting. And as always, we didn't know what to do. We were starting from scratch. We rented this little house called Casa Romero, started knocking on doors. A lot of church leaders wouldn't welcome us to talk in their faith communities. Others did. We went to universities like Auburn, were welcomed, and other universities. and started at the grassroots. And as we've learned, this is how it happens. Change does not come from top down. It's going to come from us, the grassroots, bottom up. It won't come from our leaders in Congress or our religious leaders. Forget it. When it comes to our spiritual leaders, they have become corporate executives. Our shepherds have become government sheep. And sometimes I wonder if they've ever read about this Archbishop Oscar Romero, who is a real model for them. He said, I've got a voice, I've got power. If I don't speak, I'm betraying my office. And I and others have written to our bishops and leaders in the Catholic Church and other faith communities and simply said to them, if you don't have the courage to speak out on this war in Iraq, would you please have the courage to step down and turn over your office to someone who will? And as always, I'm sure they take our letters and sort of file it away. 3 of us decided to put on Army uniforms. Larry Rosebaum, many of you may know, who had just come back from his work in Brazil. Linda Ventimiglia, who was in the Army Reserves, who had trained at Benning. We went on Fort Benning dressed as high-ranking Army officers. We had this boom box, and at the last sermon of Bishop Romero, in Spanish, his appeal he gave in the cathedral, special appeal to the men in the military, saying to them, lay down your weapons, stop the killing, disobey your superior officers telling you to kill your fellow campesinos, and obey a higher law, that law that says thou shalt not kill. It was the next day while celebrating Mass in this little church that Bishop Romero was assassinated. Silenced. But he said before, he got so many death threats, but he said, you know, they can kill me, the messenger, but the message they cannot silence. I will live on in the Pueblo, in the lives of people. And that's what martyrs do to us. They stretch us. Their message continues with even more clarity and boldness. And Romero gave us the courage we needed that night. We penetrated this high security area, went near the barracks where the Salvadorans were housed. And with tree climbers, we scaled this tall pine tree and just waited. And when the last lights went out, we just said, Bishop Romero, this is for you, brother. And his voice just moved into the barracks. It was like poking a beehive down in Georgia. We saw this as a sacred moment. They didn't quite see it that way. We were arrested, and there's so many before us when we go to court, to trial. Our goal is to put U.S. foreign policy on trial. Talk about what we were doing in El Salvador, as many is talking about today, what we're doing in Iraq, and the crimes that we are involved in, and how it's our money from our tax money that's being used here. It's being carried out in our name. But every time we spoke about foreign policy, taxes, Romero, the churchwomen, the campesinos, the old gavel came down, irrelevant. We were sent to prison for 1.5 years. And like Camilo and so many others before us, we were at peace. And we also discovered they could not silence us. We wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters to the media, to others, talking about what was going on in this little country of El Salvador. And we got out of prison in good shape. Our hope, our joy was intact. We went back to work, many of us in Chicago, around the country. We could not stop the military aid, however. It increased. It got up to $1 million a day. And the bloodshed continued. Now they went after the Jesuits, a very influential religious order. They're educators. They run 28 universities here in the U.S. Loyola, Georgetown, many others. They were upset with the Jesuits because they were calling it by its right name, idolatry, the worship of the false gods of wealth and power, which is at the very root of war in Iraq, Vietnam, and all of the wars. They, like Romero, got a lot of death threats, but they said, where are we to go? We've got to remain here. These are our people. We cannot betray them. And the military moved into their campus after midnight that November 16th of '89 and dragged the 6 Jesuits out of their rooms. With them, a young mother, Elba, and her teenage daughter, Selena. And they were shot at close range, massacred. And this made the front pages of our newspapers. All of a sudden, members of Congress are upset because they were educated, some of them, by the Jesuits. All of a sudden, it comes closer to home. They send a congressional task force to investigate. They come back from El Salvador reporting that those who did the killing were trained at the U.S. Army School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia. That's when I decided to head back to Fort Benning. Right outside of the main gate, found this little apartment. Soldier had just been transferred. I moved in. This became our SOA watch. Friends came in from around the country to join me. Charlie Bitke from California, Vietnam vet, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. A Jesuit from Boston, 2 Dominicans. Kathy Kelly came in from Chicago. 3 Salvadoran friends from the Twin Cities. We had 10 of us, a motley crew, no vision of starting any kind of a movement. Just knowing we had to come together and ask that basic question that we're asking today in this conference. What are we to do? What are we to do in the midst of this madness of war and violence? How can we go on with business as usual? After a 3-day retreat, discerning, getting to know each other and the issue better, we decided on a fast, a water-only fast. I was a little worried about Kathy. She checked in at 100 pounds. But I got to tell you, Mahatma Gandhi was right. He said if you go into a fast with love in your heart and to expose an injustice, things are going to happen. Lives will be touched, including your own. Issues will be seen, and injustice will be exposed. And that's what we did, our very first action. That fast went about 35 days. Our bodies grew weak, but the spirit was strong. People would join us from 4 to 5 in the afternoons. The numbers grew. Soldiers would seek us out sometime in the middle of the night, afraid to be seen with us, camped out at the main gate of Fort Benning during the day. They wanted to know, what did we believe in so deeply that we would go on this hunger strike? We ended our fast, and we had to get to work. We had to do research, as we all know, on these issues that we are working hard in. We've got to do our homework. We've got to get the facts. We've got to break through that ignorance that's our greatest enemy. And this School of the Americas, for many years, had been hiding behind this wall of secrecy. And very, very few knew about it, including many of us who worked in Latin America. And through the Freedom of Information Act, helped along by members of Congress like Joe Moakley and Joe Kennedy and others, Amnesty International, the basics of what we learned. Over 50,000 soldiers had trained here, and it continues. They come here to learn combat skills, commando operations, psychological warfare, counterinsurgency techniques. The basic question we asked, who are the insurgents? And what we learned, of course, in Latin America and throughout the developing world, they are who they've always been. They are the poor, those who threaten those false gods of wealth and power. They are the university students who question. They are the religious leaders like Bishop Romero and the Jesuits and the churchwomen and many others. They are the labor leaders, especially in Colombia, who are trying to organize unions and talking about land reform and a living wage. They are also the targets. Many dictators trained here. And it really angered me when I learned that this General Banzer from Bolivia, responsible for the death of so many, was inducted into the school's Hall of Fame, where his photograph was on the wall there at Fort Benning, with 20 other generals presented as model soldiers. When the United Nations Truth Commission report came out and revealed that those who killed Bishop Romero trained here, those who raped and killed the churchwomen, graduates, the 26 who massacred the Jesuits and the 2 women, 19 of them graduates. And then when the when the Washington Post on their front page talked about the torture manuals that were being used in the curriculum that advocated torture and forced information out of the detainees, word began to spread. As we know, there is no one way to get out the truth. We need a lot of people doing a lot of things. And many started to come into the movement to offer their skills. What I and so many have learned, we can all do something and we can do it well. Some brought their computer skills. They started the website. Vicki Emmerman, who had never been an organizer before, from Iowa, started to do all kinds of research. Was in the Army, had her pass still to go on Fort Benning, and would go to the School of the Americas when we were in prison to start doing research and compiled all kinds of vital research that are still valid today. We got on the road and started going to universities, church groups, talking about this school. And we said in the early days, let us gather at the main gate to express our solidarity with the people of Latin America, who are the victims of our country's foreign policy. Let's call for the closing of this school. Let's use our voices for the many who have been silenced by graduates of this school. That first November, now we began with a small group after the fast, a dozen of us. And the next November, 100 came, and then 500, and then 1,000. This last November, over 20,000 gathered. 20,000. All from the grassroots. Most of those who gathered, I would say over half, were college and university students and high school students who have become the backbone of our movement. And I have to tell you, it gives me special joy to see the youth coming into this movement. And they know it's just not about the School of the Americas. This is really a door to Latin America, and more important, a door to U.S. foreign policy and what's going on in Iraq. It's, in a way, it's an introduction also to activism, to peacemaking. We have a lot of vets there. Camilo Mejia spoke there, of course, and many others. Union leaders from Colombia, university leaders from the U.S., and many others. At night, we take over the town. Interesting, a while back, I would have to do for the first few years all of the calling to the local hotels for group rates. And then in the 6th year, when we got up to about 4,000 coming in November, I got a call from the Visitors Bureau. When is your next convention going to be? dawned on us that we were pumping a lot of money into this community, filling up their hotels and restaurants, and now they've got to go to Auburn, Alabama to get hotels. And now, in the early days, they referred to us as a small group of outside agitators. Get out of town, they said. And right now, many have on, they're on display, welcome peacemakers. Amazing. And we have a lot of parents with their children. What better place to come with our children to teach about peacemaking? At night, all kinds of workshops and all kinds of issues. Sunday, it's more solemn. We have the funeral procession. It's become a tradition in the movement. Thousands, 20,000 strong. We march toward the main gate down Fort Benning Road. The gates are locked. These signs, every 20 feet, no trespassing. I won't tell you where I got this sign here. Topped with barbed wire, like some of those high security prisons we see in the U.S. And down the road is the School of the Americas, now called WINSET. And it's here that they try to say to us, we're teaching democracy. We're teaching human rights. We say, of course, many in the movement who have been in the military, we did not learn democracy in the military. We don't teach democracy behind the barrel of a gun or behind this chain link fence that says no trespassing. No, no. And we march in unison in procession that Sunday. Thousands carrying these white crosses with the names of the victims, holding up photographs, some with the Star of David. And as we march and process, the names are called out. And in unison, everyone there will say, presente. This person is present with us. It's here that we touch on the sacred, many weep. We get to the fence, we put the crosses and religious symbols in that chain link fence. We turn it into this memorial wall. You can't see the other side. It's been a tradition in our movement whenever we gather, since the first vigil. Some feel compelled to go over that fence, under it, or cut a hole through it, to bring the message to the headquarters. And when we cross onto Fort Benning, they're waiting. The charge is trespassing. Over 200 of our people now have gone off to prison. There are university students, senior citizens, parents, grandparents, veterans. And when they go to prison, of course, they just energize the movement. They bring more than next November. We have 10 of our people in prison now, and we remember them in a special way as they do their time from the action last November. Let me just say that we're not going away. This coming November, we're going to be back at the main gate. It's the weekend before Thanksgiving. It'd be great if you can be with us. Check out our website, soaw.org, about those group rates at the hotels and where all the events are going to take place, location at the main gate where most of the activity will take place. Let me just say there's two signs of hope, and then I'll close and turn it over to Kathy and Cindy. Two signs of hope. The first is our legislative work in Washington. Every year we go to Washington and knock on those doors, remind those members of Congress that it's our money they are using to run this school. And what we say is not complicated. We don't want you to use our money for this kind of school. We want that money going into schools for our children here at home and other places. Last year we lost by six folks. Something else so important. since August of 2006, they stopped releasing to us through the Freedom of Information Act the names of the graduates, which are very, very important, because with those names, when there are human rights abuses in all these different countries, we go to the list, and that's the way it's been. And inevitably, I would say 80% of those names would show up on that list, those who are identified with human rights abuses, especially coming out of Colombia today, the most dangerous of all countries for union workers. Members of Congress who have supported us over the years said we have a right to those names, especially in light of the Pentagon saying that this school is all about transparency and openness and democracy. And of course we say this is just a lie. A lie. And so for now, for the last actually 3 years, this is what they give us. All of the names blacked out. They give us the country, most of them coming in from Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, but not the names. Well, 2 nights ago, there was an amendment to the Defense Appropriations Bill calling, saying to the Pentagon, you must release those names.
Yes.
There was this debate on the House floor about 10 o'clock just a couple of nights ago, and we were glued to C-SPAN. And I'm happy to say that they voted, and we won. 220 to 189. Those before the conference committee, which our supporters are saying it's going to pass, and the Pentagon has 60 days to give us those names. 60 days. One other sign of hope. It's a new strategy we came up with the sea change taking place in Latin America. As many of you know, things are happening in many countries down the south. Countries that have been very, very dominated by the empire are saying, basta, enough. They are saying to us, and this is, let me just say, what we did, our first visit was to Venezuela. Well, we met with President Chavez some time ago. And the purpose of that meeting was to request that Venezuela sever its ties to this school, a country that had sent over 4,000 soldiers here. He said he had to consult his ministers, and just a couple of weeks later, we got official word from Venezuela that they have pulled out all of their troops. And at our big annual strategy meeting in Washington, we simply said, let us now go to every country in Latin America, sending their soldiers to this school of assassins, and appeal to them to cut them off. And so we got on the road, we brought together a delegation, and over the last 2 years, we have gone to 15 countries down in Latin America. We've met with 5 presidents, many defense ministers, university students, and wherever we go, we have a press conference, well attended, good press, where we always hold up those names, of course, and we meet with a lot of indigenous leaders, as in Bolivia, Ecuador, and elsewhere, and we talk at the universities there. And let me just say, it's been very educational. We travel with a lot of information, documentation, wherever we go in meetings with the presidents or high-ranking leaders. And often we're stopped. They remind us that they know this school very well. They say to us, we have been on the receiving end. They're quite surprised, however, to hear that over 200 of our people here in the U.S. and the Empire have gone off to prison, and some are always in prison in our movement, for expressing their solidarity with their country and their vision and their new leaders. What we found so often in our travels is this word, it's really kind of a household word now. they talk about our country as El Imperio, the empire. As we know, that's the way it is, the empire. Lots been a lot more being written about this, and that's how they see us, El Imperio, the new conquistadors who have come into their countries to exploit their cheap labor and their natural resources. And today, they're bringing into their governments, especially in Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, Paraguay, Argentina, Chile, and other countries, leaders who are more aligned with the poor than El Imperio. And they are saying, no más. And I think what captured it very well, one of our first trips, we were in Argentina, where they were celebrating, actually remembering the 30-year revolution, the coup that started the Dirty War 30 years ago. When President Kirchner was in the plaza before thousands saying, nunca más, never again, will we allow our military to do what they did to our country. And he didn't stop there. He said, shame on you. Shame on our media for their silence. Shame on our church leaders for their silence. And this is what's happening now in the sea change. Countries are saying no to the empire. What we also heard is that we are welcome. Pero no como antes, not as before. Not to come in to take, to exploit. If we can come in as a partner in their development, bienvenidos, bienvenidos, but not as before. And that's the question. Of course, we know there's no hope with this present administration. No hope at all. Will our next president and administration be able to go to other countries as a partner, as a friend in their development, not seeing them as the enemy or some country to exploit that has really been at the core of our country's foreign policy for decades? So we found a lot of hope. Let me just say in closing, 5 countries, because of our visits there, 5 countries have said no to the school, have pulled out their troops, have severed their ties. They being Venezuela, Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. In a few months, we're going to Paraguay, where there's a new president, Lugo. We're going to meet with him, who's loved by the poor, a well-known activist, which is very unusual, a Catholic priest. Most, as you know, are very, very silent. Not this one. He's like Bishop Romero. And we're going to meet with him. And then we're going off to Chile. We've got work to do. We're going to continue our Latin America project. In the back, there's an updated DVD on the line that talks more about our Latin America initiative on the table as you come in, along with some handouts, our latest newsletter. We'll be going on a delegation to Venezuela in August, bringing folks from the U.S. to Venezuela to see what's going on there. Very important delegation. Sure to take a flyer on that. But let me just say, we move ahead. Our hope is strong. And like Bishop Romero said, who has been such an inspiration to me personally and to our movement, before he was assassinated, our graduates of this school, Bishop Romero said that those who have a voice speak out. Speak out for peace and struggle for justice. And that's where we come in. That's at the core, of course, of this conference, and that's what we're doing. And I just hope that each of us can speak clearly and act boldly in these challenging times. Thank you.
Thank you, Roy. I just want to check, is Kianu Sanjari here? Okay, he was going to be one of the panelists, but we'll have to catch catch up with him another time. Clark Webb very kindly gave me a note that I think is of importance to all of us. So I want to first check with Roy and Cindy. The note says that information has just come that the cafeteria here closes at 1 p.m. Oh, you were there. Okay, so William Bloom says the cafeteria closes at 1:30, and he's a knowledgeable man. So, okay.
Is he going to guarantee that?
He guarantees it. Okay, so then I'm guessing there wouldn't be a problem except that you might want to make haste when this session ends to go over to the cafeteria, huh? Well, so for those of you who came in late, I'd just like to repeat myself with one metaphor that I think is just so true, that we could liken Sinishi and Roy Bourgeois to redwood trees, those big, towering, gorgeous trees that also create the protection for the saplings to grow. And I think, so many people took heart after 9/11 when people said our grief is not a cry for war, even among them, people who had lost loved ones. But Cindy Sheehan, who is with us today, is somebody who, even after her son was murdered, killed, by this machine that's got such a juggernaut, the military machine, such a vice-like grip on our country, Cindy, in her grief, turned that into a means to reach the hearts and the minds of people all around the world. It's a very extraordinary phenomenon, and it's one which we've been privileged to witness. And it's one to which she has invited people steadily and graciously. And so now there's also the challenge to which she invites Nancy Pelosi. And it's a very great challenge, again, one which I think we can learn a great deal from as we all proceed to follow what Roy has said, to speak clearly and to speak courageously. And so for that blend of courage, wisdom, and love, we thank both of you. Here's Cindy.
Thank you, but I don't feel like one of the redwoods. I feel like one of the saplings. And you two are the ones that are protecting and nourishing me to grow. And Father Roy and I were laughing when you all were coming in, and Kathy was inviting everybody to come up. We might call this a Catholic panel, and I'm a recovering Catholic, but if our church leaders were like Kathy and Father Roy, I would still be a Catholic. But we were laughing because even though there's plenty of room up front, many of you are sitting in the back, and I was a Catholic youth minister. Even though I was a convert, I was a youth minister for 8 years, so I'm very well a Catholic youth minister, very steeped in the faith, very trained in the faith. I used to teach liturgy, be involved in liturgy, and Catholics always come in late, sit back, and leave early. So now we know if you leave early, you're leaving because you want to get lunch, and you don't really trust Bill that much that the cafeteria is open until 1:30. So I'm also honored to be here, and I'd like to thank Garda for all the hard work she's done in putting this together. I know all the speakers were like me, really hard to get a hold of and hard to pin down. She really had her work cut out, but she has brought together an amazing group of people for this weekend, and I hope only good things come out of it, and a clear strategy, a clear path to go forward will come from this. And I also, going through the conference book, I realized that there's many workshops and panels and discussions, but you're going to hear practically the same thing out of every workshop, because people tell me one of the major criticisms of my campaign against Nancy Pelosi is that I'm a one-issue candidate. One issue. And, well, there is only one issue. And that's why all of these issues are so intimately and intricately connected. Okay, I will admit, and I look at Kathy and Father Roy, and I feel ashamed that I haven't done more, that I haven't paid my dues. But then I realize I have paid my dues. My son was killed for this empire, and I can only go forward, and we can't ever go back. You know, we can't look back with regret on what we didn't do. We can only go forward and try to do better. But the one issue that I thought, when Casey was killed, I thought the issue was Iraq and George Bush. Okay, Iraq and George Bush and Afghanistan, they're only symptoms of a deep disease in our country. And this workshop is about oppression. Well, what is the biggest oppressor of people but war? What is the biggest oppressor of people but this U.S. military empire? And it's something that started as soon as the first white European stepped foot on our continent, with a practical extermination and genocide of our indigenous population. We are a country that is based and founded on blood and murder and oppression. We're a country that arrogantly thinks that only the white Christian male paradigm is one that should be spread. And if you're not a white Christian male, then you deserve whatever happens to you. And that is the paradigm. We have candidates. I'm not as hopeful as Father Roy about our next administration. Because if we only think about the Latin America issue, all of the candidates have come out squarely against President Chavez and for countries like Ecuador and death squads. And so I don't have any hope in any presidential administration. When you look back in history, it's just a rogues gallery of people who use the office to gain power and money and greed and to assume that they're emperors. And the only difference between George Bush's administration and Bill Clinton's or anybody else's administration is they are just so arrogant and upfront about it. And you know what? That scares me. Because they know that they won't have to be held accountable for things that they do. And the one way we can stop this oppression of this arrogance of the emperor is to hold George Bush and Dick Cheney accountable for the crimes they have committed. We have never held any of our presidents accountable. Of course, Bill Clinton was impeached, but not for what he should have been impeached for. You know, Kathy Kelly knows more than anybody in this room about the oppressive and murderous sanctions against Iraq that were leveled for a decade after the first Gulf War. And I haven't done as much work with the Iraqi people as Kathy has, but I have been able and privileged to travel to Jordan and Egypt and other countries to meet with Iraqi parliamentarians, Iraqi refugees. And they tell me during the sanction periods the official UN count is 1.2 million Iraqis dead, 500,000 children. To me, that's horrible enough, no matter what Miss Madeleine Albright says, that it was worth it. But when I talk to Iraqi doctors and teachers and mothers and fathers and family members, they tell me it was at least 2 million people who died during that period, 1 million of them children. And another monstrous thing about this oppressive empire is we don't count people of color. We don't count people who are our enemies, defined by the emperor. We don't have a good body count on this current war. Officially, George Bush admitted to 35,000 Iraqi dead, which to me is bad enough. But we know that by credible studies, that it's well over 1 million. And I know from my contacts in Iraq that it's well over 1 million. And when I am wallowing in my own grief, I remember meeting a sheikh the last time I was in Jordan. He was a Sunni sheikh. And I was at a Jordan hospital that the government of Jordan allows Iraqi doctors to practice out of, because they can't work when they go to Jordan as refugees. But the government of Jordan allows the Iraqi doctors to work. And this sheikh had brought in a Shia sheikh that had been wounded by an American bomb or gun or shrapnel or something. And he's a very well, high respected sheikh in Iraq. And I was privileged to be able to meet with him. He knows who I am. He knows that my son was killed. He knows that I have been working really hard for peace, not just to bring our soldiers home and save our soldiers' life, not just, but especially for the people of Iraq. So they will stop being killed and oppressed and harmed by the U.S. military-industrial complex. And this sheikh said, I am so sorry for your loss. But he inside was burning with anger. He said, 8 members of my own family have been killed. Dozens of members of my tribe have been killed. Yet, in the presidential election, we care more about the candidates' crazy pastors and lapel pins than we do about this issue. Iraqi children, Iraqi girls, as young as 6 years old, have to prostitute themselves to feed their families in Syria. I'm not okay with that. You know, people say, Cindy, sometimes your rhetoric sounds so angry. And I am angry. Amen. And I think we should all be angry.